Okay, sorry about that. There. And so today we're going to be talking about the R2 requirement, and we are recording this session, and we'll be sharing that soon after it's finished. And what we're going to do today is go a little bit over our progress, which we've done. We're talk about the scheduling of the sessions. A brief review again of the benefits. It's going to be very quick, and a brief overview of all the current requirements. And then we're going to talk about R01, and the homework where you're making progress with your teams on your draft application for CoreTrustSeal certification. And then we'll be talking about CoreTrustSeal requirement 2, and then hopefully introduce the CoreTrustSeal requirement 3, and go for the next session. So the repositories we have are Surgis, ICRASAT, FMNR, AFRIGIST, and Agromet. And I hope that you've been making progress on your templates. Generally speaking, if we can make progress each session on each of the requirements, and then as we're working on subsequent requirements, we can go back and look at what our drafts responses were for earlier requirements and revise those. And this way, as we identify exactly our approach here in terms of improving our capabilities and how we're going to sustain our repository, how we're going to serve our designated user community, we can refine our responses to each of the requirements, and in that way we'll gradually improve the entire draft application. If there are any people who haven't introduced themselves yet, this might be a good time to do that. I can't really see the chat at the moment, but if you could introduce yourselves in the chat and let us know which repository you're with. And if you're not with one of these 4, please let us know the one that you are with, and we can create a template for you to get started drafting your responses for the CoreTrustSeal certification. Okay, and then regarding our next session, that's scheduled for July 10th, and we're going to be going over the R3 requirement and introducing R4. Okay, so just going to be a quick review of the benefits. Ideally, we want to meet the community requirements to become a trustworthy data repository. And basically, this is really a self-assessment and self-improvement exercise where we look at how we might be able to improve the way we operate the repository, and we can conduct an internal assessment, and eventually, once we have that prepared and documented in the application, we can go ahead and request an external review, and we'll get feedback from the community on that. And so, as I mentioned before, the CoreTrustSeal requirements are evolving over time, and every 3 years they issue a new revision to the CoreTrustSeal requirements. So in terms of what it means to be a trustworthy digital repository, uh, basically it means we're providing long-term access and use for our designated community of the resources that we're offering to them. And the certification process enables us to continually improve and get better at what we're doing, how we're serving our community, and resolving any issues we find. Um, and that now allows us to be recognized. And also it allows our host institution, our funders, the data producers, those who are all members of our designated community, to be recognized for being a CoreTrustSeal certified repository. It also offers branding, and that can facilitate some collaborations and partnerships. And basically, this is a way for us to continually improving our capabilities as digital repositories. And so you've seen this slide before, and I just want to emphasize that it does provide eligibility for World Data System membership. So that's a great opportunity. And World Data System membership is a way to work within the community and get advice from other members, see what others are doing, and how you can improve in ways similar to how others have improved. And basically, the whole community is working together trying to improve their capabilities. And we're also improving the transparency of our practices so that our communities that we're serving can see exactly how we are managing the resources we have and enabling their use. Okay, if there are no questions about that, I know we've gone over that before, but I just wanted to reinforce that a little bit. We can move on to the CoreTrustSeal certification and processes. So as I mentioned, currently we're working on the 2023 to 2025 requirements, and next year they're going to start revising those or create the 2026 to 2028 requirements. And all of the repositories that are in the community have an opportunity to contribute to the revisions. So if a repository sees that it's not clear in a particular requirement, they can suggest that the language be improved for clarity, and that way the requirements will get better over time. And basically, the community recommends these changes, and the changes are reviewed by the community, or proposed changes, I should say. The community looks at them, the Assembly of Reviewers, the board, they're all recommending changes, and in that way, the requirements will evolve. Okay, just to briefly go over this process again. Initially, what we're doing is we're conducting a self-assessment, and I'm hoping that each of the repositories can be doing that within the template so that we can document how our repository is doing in terms of meeting each requirement. But more importantly, we can document how we might improve to meet that requirement. In other words, we don't always have all our capabilities in place when we start this process. And so what we need to do is identify ways in which we can improve certain capabilities to meet a requirement, and documenting that, we need to do this. This capability should be enhanced a bit, etc. As we go through that. And this way, we have a marker, if you will, of the things that we need to do. And we can start to work on them, not just necessarily working on one item at a time, but as we see some items, as we're going through the requirements, are similar to other items, we can decide we're going to improve two things at the same time or three things. And that way, it'll be more efficient for us to improve them. And often the capabilities are interacting with each other within our systems. And so uh, one of the important things to do, though, is to document any public-facing links. That is, links to web pages on our websites that we can point to as evidence. And one of the things that I've been doing, working with various repositories, is we identify the link, but we also say on that page, we need to do this, this, and this. These things need to be improved just on that one page so that we know exactly where the improvements have to take place. So if we have 3 or 4 links of evidence for a particular requirement, we're identifying for each one of those links what has to be done so that our evidence will show that what we say we're doing is in fact what we are doing. So we complete the application form, and in our case, what we're doing first is we're completing a draft application form. And this way, once it's all ready to be submitted, then we can go in the online application form and start to enter our responses to each of the requirements and include the links for the evidence that is associated with each of our responses. And also, there is an administrative fee, but they have different ways in which the fee can either be waived or reduced. And so that's an opportunity as well. And then once we're completing the requirements, what we want to do is to assess our compliance level ourselves. That is, we want to determine and state whether we believe we're in progress or whether the requirement has been implemented at our repository. And that information helps us to improve as we're going along, but it also helps when they're conducting the review. Each of the reviewers makes an assessment too. And so if you're putting implemented, they might say, well, I don't see this in there. And so they'll make a comment that this particular aspect is missing, and then they will mark the compliance level as in progress so that the repository knows that these are the things that they have to improve to move forward. So 2 members of the assembly are reviewing each of the CoreTrustSeal applications, and when they're assigning a compliance level, they're doing this for each of the responses. And of course, they're adding comments as appropriate. And then the CoreTrustSeal Standards and Compliance Board, they review the applications and the review notes that were produced by the members of the Assembly of Reviewers who reviewed the application. And the CoreTrustSeal board at that point will make an assessment either to send it back or to approve it. And to be quite frank, I really haven't seen any applications that have been approved on the first round. If a member of the Assembly of Reviewers doesn't catch something that needs to be improved, certainly the board will catch something, and they'll give a recommendation for how the repository should be improved, and send that back to the repository so that they can try to improve their capabilities in terms of any requirements that were in progress. I also should mention that when receiving a certification, every single requirement does not necessarily have to be implemented. You could have a couple that are in progress, but if that's the case, the expectation will be that the repository will work on improving those so that the next time they go up for certification, the those areas uh, have been revised, the improvements have been made, and so the repository in that sense will have uh, 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 ideally attained implemented compliance level for each of the requirements when they request renewal of their CoreTrustSeal certification. And so basically the process is the repository, they look for opportunities for improving their capabilities, and they decide what has to be done, what they will need to do that. They might need expertise, they might need some particular tools or techniques to employ. As they're improving, they're continually self-assessing how they're doing in terms of each of the requirements. And they also can look at how other repositories met a particular requirement. And that's what we're going to be doing as we're going through each of these requirements. We'll look at some examples so that we can see what, and each repository is doing it differently, which is the most interesting aspect of this. Each repository is individual. They have their own designated community. They have their own way of serving their community. And so we'll see as we review some of these applications that each one has taken a different approach. And then ideally, each repository will get certified, and that certification will be valid for a 3-year period. And if there were any deficiencies, that is where there's a particular requirement that's in progress, the goal would be for that repository to have those revised and improved so that the next time they go for recertification, that they could get implemented across the entire board. That is where every single requirement is considered implemented. So that's the process generally. And if there are no questions, we're going to move forward and just go do a very brief review of all the requirements so that we see them all together. We've talked about the background information where you provide the context in R0. We've been working on the requirements associated with organizational infrastructure. Then we're going to look at the digital object management requirements. And then finally, the requirements that are associated with technology. And so as we had talked about R0, there are a lot of different elements to that. And I hope that you've been discussing these with your team so that you can identify how each of these different aspects of R0 can be addressed by your repository. We're going through R1, R2, etc. so far. And the rest are all within this organizational infrastructure. We'll review each of these and hopefully make progress on them. And then likewise, do the same with the digital object management requirements. And then finally, with the information technology and security requirements. So let's take a few moments to review R0. We'd gone over it a few weeks ago, and I'm hoping that each of the repositories has been drafting their responses. As I mentioned before, you don't necessarily need an RE3 data or RE3 data identifier yet, but you certainly want to look at the RE3 data website and look at how other repositories have described themselves in there. And you can draft within your template a little overview of your repository and how you would describe it in RE3 data so that you'll be prepared to register with RE3 data when you have everything set. There's no cost to register for RE3 data. And so, and this is a good advertisement for your repository. When people who have data are looking for a repository to submit their data, often they go to RE3 data. Likewise, when people are trying to find data and they're looking for some data that are related to the topic of interest, they also search RE3 data to find the repository that might be ideal for them to visit to look for their data. And so each repository is deciding on either whether they're a generalist or a specialist repository. And each repository is just briefly describing their repository, and I gave you some examples. And we have some certified repository applications that we provided in the Google Drive. So you should be looking at those in terms of how each one is different and thinking about how you could provide just a very brief overview of your repository. Likewise, how you might be able to describe your designated community. That is the knowledge base, if you will, their level of understanding, their areas of expertise that are expected. And this way, you're showing that this is the community you're serving and you understand how to serve them. And then providing the or describing your level of curation. And you might recall a repository can be performing more than one level of curation. Some items might be deposited and they're ready to go. And so the repository would just distribute those as they're received, maybe just do some brief checking or some basic metadata. But other repositories or even ones that are just doing basic curation might also decide to do enhanced curation as well. So that there they could be converting the data to new formats or enhancing the documentation further. They could also be doing data level curation, where they're even adding more value to the data, some additional editing, and making sure that the documentation and the data are completely accurate and, most importantly, usable by their community, their designated community. Also, there's an opportunity to describe any cooperation you have, for example, with partners within your organization. Often that's referred to as insourcing, or outsourcing, where you're working with external third parties or other partners. And once you've completed the application and been certified, when you go for renewal, you would also describe uh, any significant changes that have been made since your last application. But in the case of all of our repositories here, this is our first round, so we don't have to describe any changes since the last application. So for R0, the assignment was to discuss within our teams how we might have a description for re3 data, and also to draft some responses for R0 for the repository, all within the templates that we're working on, so that we can begin to make progress. As you recall, the re3 data stands for Registry of Research Data Repositories, and this is a way to get your repository known. And because it is the Registry of Repositories, the expectation is that
Okay, I found this on web for it.
oh, my phone somehow turned on. Sorry. The repository community wants to see that every single CoreTrustSeal certified repository is in fact registered in re3 data. So you basically just describe your repository, giving its title, the different subject areas that are covered, and types of content, the country where you are, and just a brief narrative description. But you want to be drafting that entire response within your templates. And so continue discussing that with your teams and documenting how each of these different items will be described in re3 data, so that you can eventually register for re3 data. Likewise, you want to describe whether you're a generalist or a specialist repository. I suspect that most of your repositories will be specialist repositories, and most that apply for CoreTrustSeal certification are specialist repositories. The description of the repository just has to be a few sentences, just one paragraph. There will be plenty of opportunities to describe your repository in other way as we move through each of the requirements. And likewise, as we're describing our repository under each requirement, we can go back and revise our description in the template. Likewise, we want to do that with the designated community. And there will be requirements where we talk more about the designated community as well. But it's good to first get that drafted, just a very brief draft statement in there, just a paragraph about the designated community, some of the methodologies they might be familiar with, the types of data, etc. And then choose which levels of curation your repository is performing. And it might be that for most of the data, you're perhaps doing enhanced curation, but for some, you do basic curation. So if you're doing any of these, you might want to just go ahead and say, we're doing this. Content distributed as deposited if it's warranted, etc. And then describe your levels of curation in that way. And you're giving a brief explanation of those. And then, as I mentioned, any cooperation that you have, either inside your organization or outside, should be described. So if you're working with the library, for example, in your institution, or you're working with the IT folks in your institution, this is the place to mention it. Likewise, if you have a vendor that you're working with, you have a contract or some kind of an agreement with a vendor to provide a service for you, that should be described here as well. We're not renewing, so we won't go over that. And so looking at what we went over last time, the mission and scope for R1, the homework was to go over each of these and to provide draft responses for them as well. And so each repository should have a mission statement, and it should be publicly accessible on their website. The mission statement should be approved by some authority within your organization. It could be a governing board.
Oui, oui.
Is there a question? Yes, a question?
Uh-huh.
Do we have a question, Kabor?
No, he needs to mute
Say that
himself. Kabore, looks like he's unmuted.
Yes, please, Robert, can you mute him? You can also mute him.
Rob,
please
you
mute.
should be able to mute people yourself if you're the owner of the meeting.
Okay, let me see what I can do here.
Mhm.
I might have to take this
Ya uto.
out here.
In exit presentation mode.
Nyewa, some them define, you know.
Okay, let me see the participants here and see if I can mute.
Kabore.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you, Ellie.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks.
okay, thank you. Okay, let's resume. And share the screen again. Oh, okay, let's find our place. Okay, and so we were talking about R01 mission and scope. And so we want to make sure that an authority has approved our mission statement and document that in the template describing what authority has approved the mission statement. An important thing about R1, you might recall, is that we should be referring to preservation. And it could be either referred to in the mission statement, or that could be referred to at on another web page that's publicly accessible, where we're telling the community about what we do. But the important thing here is that we do mention preservation somewhere. That is, that we're preserving our data and information resources so that our designated community can use them in the future. That is, we're certainly providing access to the resources today, but we also have to make sure that we're providing access to them tomorrow, next year, and in the future, so that the members of our designated community who are using resources today and decide they want to go back and use those same resources next year, they can do that. Likewise, if somebody is using a particular resource and perhaps they write a paper and they cite the resource, the title of the resource and the location where it's accessible from your repository, some other researcher who's reading that paper and they decide that they want to use the same resource, they can go back in the future and get that same resource. And so it's important that we're preserving the data and information resources for future use by our community. And so we had talked about examples last week or last time. And then here's an example we're looking at that talks about the CDAC mission statement here. And as you can see, it's a very concise saying we focus on human interactions in the environment and develop and operate applications that support the integration of socioeconomic and neuroscience data and serve as an information gateway between the earth and the social sciences. Very simple statement, and each repository should have a mission statement. If you don't have a mission statement, I would suggest drafting in your template a little bit of a mission statement. If you're not sure of how it should be worded, just start to include some of the key terms that you think are relevant to your mission. And then working with your teams, you can begin to look at it in more detail and think about how the relationship is between these different terms and how you would want to describe them in a mission statement, which generally should be brief. And then you might see here, we also, we talk about preservation of data and the and related information resources and how we do that. So we talked last time about the examples, and here's an example of a response from the LADS DAC. It's one of the data centers in the Earth Science Data Information System, often referred to as ESDIS, of NASA. And you see here a portion of their response here. And what's important to notice is that they're giving references here. And so they do have links in here to the references, but the application form also has a separate area where you list the links as references. And so in the case here, they really didn't have to put in the URLs if they just put in perhaps parentheses, the date or the title of the web page. That would be sufficient. Likewise with the last paragraph where you look at where they have the whole URL for a PDF file, they actually didn't have to do that because you could put that in the listing of links that are associated with each response. Looking at another example, this is from the Australian Social Science Data Archive, and you see they have their compliance level is that they've implemented it, and you'll see they're doing their references differently. And so in the first sentence there, they have a numeric 1 that they're referring to refer to the link. And so what they've done in the section of links, as you see at the very bottom, they have a numeric 1, and then they have a link to their mission statement. And so it's a lot simpler to do it that way and easier, I think, for the reviewers to follow. And so I would suggest that in for each of your responses in the template that you not only draft your response, and if, as I mentioned, if you don't have a mission statement yet, draft it, just a brief mission statement as well, and then identify links. The link to a mission statement, if you don't have one, certainly that's a good place to put a note for yourself to create a web page with the mission statement on it. Likewise, any related links, as we saw in the previous example, they can be pointed to as well to help to reinforce your response. So I'm hoping that each of the repositories has been making progress in their templates, and as you've been working on your templates, making progress, if there are any questions that you might have about your mission statement or the approval of your mission statement, what the appropriate level of authority might be. In the case of a repository, it could be the person who's the manager of the repository, or it could be the person who is the head of the center where the repository is located, or the department where the repository is located. And then, importantly, ideally, what you want to do is to have your mission statement, once it's approved, to put it online, that is on a web page, and so that you can link to that web page in your response. And so for each of the draft responses that are being developed in the template, please put in the relevant links. And if you don't have links yet, that's a good place to put a note in. We need to create a link for a particular or either the mission statement or some other supporting evidence. Are there any questions on that so far? Okay, well, not hearing any, let's move along to R2 then.
Bob, one question. What, when you say an authority would have to approve a mission statement, what does that exactly mean? Let's say Sergius, which is based at the University of Ghana. Does that mean that some organ within the higher organ and within the University of Ghana would need to approve Sergius's mission statement?
No, not necessarily. If the repository, that is, if Sergius is managed by a team and they have a person who's leading that team, or a group of managers who are leading that team, perhaps they are the leadership team for Sergius, that team can approve the repository. So it could be one person who's just the manager of Sergius. They could be the approving authority, or it could be 2 or 3 people who are serving as the leadership team. But if the repository is organized differently, so say, as an example, within a department, so if Sergius is within a department, perhaps the department head, that is the chairperson of the department, or the director of the department, that person might be the one who's approving it. But also, if the department has a leadership team, that is, perhaps there's a director and maybe a deputy director or associate directors, as a team, they might want to review and approve the mission statement, because the mission statement is a guiding document. That is, it not only tells the world what we're trying to do as a repository, but also the staff members within the repository can look at the mission statement to identify direction for how they're going to move forward in terms of serving their community, how they might want to better serve their community. And so this mission statement is providing the guidance for really not only the designated community, but for the repository itself. And the repository might want to review their mission statement over time. And it doesn't have to be a permanent mission statement. They might decide every 5 years that they're going to review their mission statement. And in that case, it might be the manager of the repository who has decided that a revision is
Okay,
needed.
I think that's sufficient, Bob. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's a great question. Okay, so moving into requirement rights management, the requirement states the repository maintains all applicable rights and monitors compliance. And so the idea here is that you have an approach to managing rights, and that this is a written approach, and it's the rights associated with copying the data or information that you have. The rights would enable you to transform the data if you need to, and to store it for future use, that is to preserve it, if you will. It also should mention any conditions of use, that is, if there are any restrictions associated with the use of the data, um, if the data can be distributed by others, that is redistributed by others, often we call that third-party distribution, where somebody else, they want to redistribute the data that you're distributing. And so your right statement might say that people can do anything with it if it's very open data, and others can redistribute the data if they want. But your rights could also have various conditions for using the data, and say that generally speaking, you can't redistribute the data unless you request permission. And then it's up to the repository to decide whether they want somebody else to distribute that data. And that's really up to each repository to make the decisions about their rights management. And it might be that the repository decides that it's going to treat each object differently, that it is depending on where they receive who they receive the data from, uh, and what the uses or potential uses of the repository might be, what others might want to do with the data. And so if that's the case, the repository approach might be to handle each data product individually in terms of assigning rights. And the important thing is that they document for the data products that they are disseminating what rights are associated with them. And so the approach should describe how the repository is managing those rights. That is, what they're allowing people to do, what they're not allowing people to do. If they decide that all their data are open, for example, the approach could be that they say that all our data are open, and anybody can do anything they want with the data. On the other hand, some data might have to be restricted in various ways. And if your approach is to have such restrictions, you should mention that as well, that we're going to restrict data, certain data products based on what's in the data, and where the data might be representing, the location where the data might be representing, or who provided the data. And so that's up to each repository. And if your approach is to enable everyone to use the data. That is, it's an open data approach. That should be mentioned in the metadata for each data set. So the approach should be described in that manner. That is, when you describe your approach, you should say the metadata for each data product describes the rights associated with the data. And in this way, it's understood that you know how you're going to manage your rights, because you're going to determine what the rights are for each data product, and then you're going to document the rights associated with that data product in the metadata for that data product. So, as I said, some repositories decide to have open data where everything is freely accessible, and anybody can really do whatever they want with the data. There are no restrictions at all. And that's just one approach. But a repository might decide that they don't want to have it completely open, that certain data sets will be restricted. But if you have your rights described in the metadata for each data set, then you can handle such conditions for each data set individually and just describe in the metadata, well, this particular data set, for example, is restricted based on a particular uses. We only want it used for certain purposes, or we only want it, or they could even say certain parts of the data set are restricted. They could say parts of the data set that are associated with a particular location cannot be described by others, or those parts of the data set can't be redistributed by others, but other parts of the data set can be used in any manner. And also, when the repository is getting data from data producers, the data producer is, if you will, submitting the data to them or depositing the data. As part of the appraisal process, the repository might engage in a negotiation. That is, asking the depositor what rights they would prefer are associated with the data or assigned to the data. And the repository might explain to the depositor the advantages of perhaps making the data more open, for example. Or if the data contains some sensitive information, they could explain to the depositor that we might want to restrict certain parts of the data and not even disseminate it publicly. That is, only allow the data to be used under certain conditions if they contain sensitive information. And so this negotiation, if you will, and descriptions of how the data might have rights associated with them, this should be written down so that the depositors, the people who produce data, will be able to read about what their rights are, what the rights might be for the data, what rights might be assigned to the data, and if there's a form that the repository has that they offer for people to assign rights to the data, that would be a good place to make that form available and ask for the depositors to complete that form, often by signing it as well, so that the agreement between the data producer and the repository is documented, so that there's no question about what rights have been associated with any particular data set later on. And so there can be particular stipulations, if the data does have to have some conditions associated with it, but the repository and the data producer might just decide that the data are going to be completely open. And in fact, they might decide that they want to just have a what's called a waiver of rights. That is, they're not going to claim any rights, and they're going to offer the data to the public under what is called a public domain data license. And so that's just one of many different licenses that a data producer might assign to their data. And the CC0 waiver is that's one of the most open licenses there are. And so by providing your data under a CC0 waiver, basically you're saying, anybody can do whatever they want with it. But, that's just one extreme situation. Many people who produce data might want to assign a different license to their data. And certainly, if you have sensitive data, you want to license that data appropriately, and you want to describe any aspects of the data that need to be protected. And it might be you need to put a label on the data, or you might even have to restrict it so that in order to use the data, an individual would have to meet certain conditions. That is, they might have to show that they are capable of protecting the data while they're using it. You might not, you might actually have what's called an enclave where they can go in to a protected area and use the data, and you tell them, yes, you can look at the data here, but you can't copy the data because these data are protected. So these are a couple of extremes that we're looking at. The important thing is that the repository understands its approach to rights management and that they describe it. And so for homework, you would describe that in your template, your approach to managing the rights for the data. And this way, if you have a complete description of the approach, the way that you work with the depositors or data producers, if you will, in terms of assigning rights, coming to agreement on that, and during the transfer where they provide the repository with the data, and that it's completely clear. If this is completely documented, the repository should be providing a link to the place where that is documented. And it might be a simple web page where
Okay,
this is described.
Bob, so
Yes,
yeah,
Alex.
I feel like a lot of this is very theoretical and may not connect with the people who are in the training. So I thought it might be good to bring it down. So let's say ICRASAT has a data set that they developed themselves for a particular funded project. It may involve data inputs from remote sensing or from other sources and process those data in some way. And they wanted to designate them via a website. Tell me what ICRASAT would need to do in order to prove to CoreTrustSeal that it has the rights to disseminate those data.
Yes, that's a great question, Alex. So when the repository is making those data publicly accessible, ICRASAT in this case, what they would do is list ICRASAT as the author of the data. If ICRISAT produced the data, they are the author. And so that should be listed within a reference, so that anybody who is coming to ICRISAT to see what data are available, they see that data set, they see that ICRISAT is the author of the data. And since ICRISAT is the author of the data, it would be up to ICRISAT to decide on what rights they want associated with that data. And so they could assign a very open license, or a license that has partial restrictions or some conditions with it. That's up to them to make that decision. And what they would do after they've made that decision is to document the decision in the metadata that describes that data set. So in the metadata, they should have an element, that is, there's a category, if you will, associated with the rights for that data set. And in that section of their metadata, they can describe exactly what restrictions are associated with the data, what rights are associated with that data. It's easiest for ICRISAT in this case to just assign an appropriate license that might be a license that they're comfortable with. And if that's the case, they could just provide a link in their metadata to the license. That is, they could say, these data are licensed under the Creative Commons CC0 waiver, and then provide in the metadata the link to that license. And so in that case, they would be describing the rights associated with the data. It would be clear to anybody who's going to use that data set that ICRISAT is the author of the data set, and as the author of the data set, ICRISAT has defined what the rights are, and they've assigned a license so that anybody can read that license to understand their rights. And so that's one way that ICRISAT can approach this. But ICRISAT also might want to have an open data policy, or a data policy, at least, if their data aren't all open. And what I'm showing you here is an example of the just an excerpt from the season open data policy. And so one important part of the policy is really right here in the very first paragraph. And what season has gone and said is, if you read the very last sentence, season's policy is to make data open by default, with only narrow exemptions for genuine security, privacy, or legal concerns. And so in a nutshell, if you will, season is describing its approach to data in this one sentence. And the rest of this whole open data policy describes how they make the data open by default. And so, and if you actually go to the link here, you'll see where they even give examples of the licenses that are assigned to data, and often in many cases, and how they work with the community to determine the license that is associated with the data. We can see here another example, and this example is talking about the data licenses that are assigned to the data. And so this is an example from CDAC, the National Socioeconomic Data and Application Center. And so it describes its licenses. And this is part of a statement that it has on a web page where they give guidance to data producers who are planning to submit their data to CDAC. So the data producers can read this section of that guidance, the online guidance, and here it describes that the data producers can make their data open to the public by completing what's called a season open data and information agreement. And that's just a simple agreement where the data producer, they designate the data as being open and they assign a particular license to it. In this case, what Season is using is the Creative Commons attribution only license. Often that's just referred to as CC BY, and that enables anybody to use the data in any manner they would like to use the data, as long as they provide attribution to the source. And what that means is if you're going to use the data to write a paper and publish the paper, you want to reference that data in your reference section and describe the title of the data and the author of the data, for example, and where you got the data. And so going back to our ICRISAT example, if somebody is using the ICRISAT data and they're licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution license, the CC BY license, the person who's writing the paper using the data would put in the reference statement the title of the ICRISAT data set. They would list ICRISAT as the author of the data set and describe where they got the data. And if they got the data from ICRISAT, then they would describe that there and ideally put a link, a persistent identifier, if you will, to where they to the location where the data can be accessed. And so what we're looking at here is an excerpt from the form that Season uses for its open data and information agreement. And so that you could see it, I collapsed the whole thing. But here you're seeing really the main body of the agreement. And you see what Season's doing is they're asking the data producer to write down the title of the data set or the information product, the edition, a version or the date, and then also to list if there are multiple authors, the names of the authors, or if it's just an organization such as ICRISAT, you would just list ICRISAT there as the author. Also, a brief description should be placed here so that we know what the data are about. That is the location that the data represent, perhaps the time period represented, any aspects of the data that are of the location that are represented in the data, for example. That would all be included in the brief description. And so it's not asking for a lot of information. It's a very simple form, as you can see. It's here with basically 3 statements, and the data producer is saying that they are representing their co-authors on this form. That is, the information that they're providing here is being placed there on behalf of their co-authors. And so rather than requiring several people to sign the form, one person can sign the form on behalf of all the co-authors. In the case of ICRASAT, one individual who's a member of the ICRASAT team could sign it on behalf of the whole ICRASAT team. And then what the next condition is, it's just saying that the people who this individual, the signator is representing, they are the owners of the data. That is, they produce the data and they produce this for themselves as the owners. And so they're authorizing that these data are theirs.
Bob, there's
Yeah.
a hand up, Mansour's hand is
Oh,
up.
I'm sorry. I didn't see the hand up. Oh,
Yeah, yeah, I have one question. I don't understand the rubric of version and editing date. What the information as needed there, version and editing date.
Edition date. So that would be a lot of data sets will come with versions. So you have a version 1, which was the initial release. There would be maybe a version 1.1 or version 1.2 if there have been minor edits to it, or a version 2, which would be kind of a new complete, updating of the data set. There doesn't need to be an edition necessarily. I think the edition is just in there in case there are different ways that different data set providers provide their information. So some will do the release date is a signature, like if you've ever used data from the JRC, the Joint Research Center, sometimes they'll just have R 2020 and then R 2023, which would be the release date for the year that they release the data. In our case, at our NASA CDAC, we tend to use version numbers. So it'll be 1, 1.1, then it'll go up to 2, 3, 4, et cetera, depending on the data set. We're now at version 5 of our gridded population of the world, for instance. I hope that answers your question, Mansour, but feel free to add anything if it doesn't.
Yeah, it's correct. You answered the question. Thank you.
and thank you, Mansour, and thank you, Alex. And then I'll just say, the last item here at the very bottom, it just says, I agree that the listed data or information may be distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. And then it gives the link to the actual legal code. And so the person who's signing this is basically saying, we are assigning this Creative Commons license to these data. And what that license stipulates is that anybody can use the data for any purpose as long as they cite the data. That is, they provide attribution to the source of the data, as I described using like a reference in the paper. And so that is the approach that Season is using to manage its rights. That is, it's asking anybody who produces data to assign rights to the data by completing this form. And once they have completed this form and given it to Season, then what Season does is they review the form and they store it, and they use that the information in this form to describe the rights for the data set in the metadata. In other words, what they're doing is they're in the metadata for this data product, they're writing, these data are available for any type of use by anyone under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. So they're basically repeating the same information that you see here at the bottom. they're mentioning the license in the metadata for that data set, and they're providing the link to it. And this way, anybody who's using the data set can go to the metadata, read the right section, see that it's licensed under the Creative Commons license. Many people will be familiar with that, and therefore they'll know, oh yes, all I have to do is to cite the data, and I can use the data in any way that I want. And so it's a very simple approach that Season is using for CDAC. As you might recall, Season is a department at Columbia University that operates CDAC for NASA. And so CDAC does this, manages the rights approach so that CDAC can receive the rights from the data producers and then document those rights in the metadata for the data. So let me show you another example here. Here is the rights management response that the Australian Antarctic Data Center is using. And you see here, they have a data policy and they show a link to it. They also have conditions of use, and they're showing a link to that. They also describe the licenses. And so in their case, they're using the CC BY 4.0 license, which is the same license that you saw the Season uses too. And the reason is it's a very simple license, and it's what's called an open license. And so a lot of organizations use that same license. But each organization is certainly free to choose whatever license they want. And then you'll see here in their rights management statement, they list a couple of conditions here. They remain the property of the Commonwealth of Australia. They are expected to be cataloged and archived. The data are collected as part of the Australian Antarctic Data Center, are expected to be made publicly available. And they're expected to be correctly, people who use the data are expected to correctly cite the data. So this is a very succinct response here, very clear. And this way, anybody who's reading this knows exactly what the approach is of the Australian Antarctic Data Center. Let me give you another example here. This is the example from the ICSD. I forget what that stands for. But they are using a license agreement, and they're saying that all data are subject to the license agreement. So they're saying that there has to be an agreement in place, and the agreement is with their organization, which is the FIZ Carl Rouge. And so here they're describing that they have a user interface, regular licenses are used, they monitor the downloads. They're going into a bit of detail here. They're talking about the services they provide, including the web services, the desktop services, and then also they go in and talk about their in-house intranet. Now, this is a lot of detail that they're providing, but they feel that this is all part of their approach, so they wanted to describe it in this way. You see that this is completely different than the approach that we saw from the Australian Antarctic Data Center. And as I said, each repository has a different approach. So as we think about this, what would be great is if in your template, each repository describes their approach to rights management. And if you don't have an approach yet, that's fine. You might want to make a note, though, that we need to describe our approach. We need to describe how we let the data producers know what our approach is. In other words, we need to create a web page where we describe how data producers can manage the rights. They can assign rights to the data so that the repository, whether it's ICRASAT or SERVIR, they can then manage the rights for that data. And what that means is they're going to have evidence that they hold about those rights. That is, if they have an agreement with the rights holder, they will document that and hold on to it and use that to describe the rights in the metadata for the data, so that anybody who goes to use the data will be able to use that. And so in your template, please go ahead and start describing your approach to the rights. So looks like I have a couple minutes left to just introduce R3 here. And generally, R3 is associated with what we call continuity of service.
Bob, yeah, I think moving ahead may not be a good idea in the last couple minutes. So
Okay,
what I
yes.
propose is, if there's any questions about the rights management, this is maybe a concept that is, not as familiar in the West African context, where, I haven't worked and lived in the region some. I know that data are often handed to you that people come across data that may have unclear provenance, which is a term that means provenance essentially means where did the data come from, and who produced them, what was the purpose, etc. And I know that I've been handed hard, sticks, smart sticks, and in the back in the day, DVDs and CDs that had data on them, and I didn't really have a lot of information about where the data came from. So really the point of R2 is to essentially ensure that you have a better hold on and fix on where the data came from. If they came from a third party, making sure that you get a signed agreement as we describe, and as Bob put on the screen, the one that we have, where it's a signed piece of paper that says the person who's giving you the rights actually also possesses the rights to give the rights to you. So it's both twofold. It's not just they're assigning rights to you, but they actually have to sort of state by signing that they actually have the rights to the original data. Copyright and things like this are critically important in the US context because data are a commodity. In West Africa, I don't know if that's so much the case. And a lot of the data that you are dealing with in your respective centers are probably what we would call public goods. They're data that are beneficial to scientists and researchers and maybe to governments, but not necessarily commercially viable data products that people would pay money for. Anyway, I wanted to just open up the discussion. I know we're now at time, so I would just say, if you have any thoughts or questions at this point, this is a good time to ask them. And it looks like people have to get off. Some people already had to get off owing to another meeting earlier. I guess I missed the message, but at 10 o'clock. But if you have questions, I do. Yeah, go ahead, please, Garba.
Okay, hi Alex. I just want to say that it's very important what we see. So I think we have to make some exercise with the service FMNR, and we are going to be in touch with Robert to see maybe for the future training, we will take an example like FMNR activities. service. Over.
Yeah. That's excellent. Thank you for your observations. Was there another person who was trying to unmute? I couldn't tell. Zaharuddin or someone.
Yes, thank you. I'm just wondering about one thing, for example, regarding data access. For example, if ICRISAT collected or gathered data from some third parties, for example, some NGOs that are implementing action on the ground here in Niger, the problem is sometimes, for example, the data the collection have not gone through like let's say like a strong or rigorous scientific requirements or something, but still the data is important
Sure.
and can really guide decision making, especially in terms of agricultural or environmental practices implementation. So what to do here, for example, in terms of like to guarantee that people that use the data, for example, why I'm asking this question is that somebody might probably like find something else while using rigorous scientific methods, for example, and that can compromise the quality of the data like provided initially like through the repository. So I'm just wondering if you can give like a brief clarification on that.
So maybe I can handle the first question. And Bob, maybe you track the second part. I got distracted for a second, I have to confess. But the question of rights has very little to do with whether the data are valuable or useful or scientifically rigorous or not. So I would just try to separate those two issues out. If those data that you've collected from NGOs are useful for planning, policy purposes, or whatever, then all you need to do is basically ensure that you have the right to disseminate the data. And you can write any limitations you want in the documentation of the data to say, these were collected under the following circumstances, they may not be complete, there may be biases in the sample, that kind of thing. And that will be enough to kind of cover, but it's really two separate matters. Bob, I didn't know if you caught the second part of the question, if you want to respond.
Yes, and actually, in the data policy that Season has, what they say in their data policy is that they're not guaranteeing the applicability of the data for any particular purpose. And they say that the data are available as is, where is. That is, people are really using the data at their own risk. They are deciding how they want to use the data and whether the data are applicable for the purpose that they're planning to use the data for. And so in this case, Season is not guaranteeing the applicability of the data. They're not guaranteeing that every single value is correct for all time. What they're saying is that the person who uses the data, they have to make their own assessment in terms of whether they think the data are appropriate for their planned use. And so as part of the rights management approach, where Season has developed their data policy, their open data policy, they actually state in there that the data are open and people are free to decide how they want to use the data, but Season is not guaranteeing the use of any of the data products that are distributed by CDAC or by any of the other projects that Season manages. So this way, Season is telling the user of the data that it's their own responsibility to assess how they think the data might be valuable for their use or not valuable. And that's really up to each individual user to decide.
Okay, I would like to know, like, how does this has to relate to the level of curation of the repository, for example, in the requirement 0?
Yes, yeah, that's a great question. And so in this case, the repository might be looking at the data and deciding that the data are not documented very well. So that the user won't be able to understand the potential applicability of the data. So ideally, what the repository would want to do is to uh, add more documentation, work with the data producer to describe how the data might be used for different purposes, what purposes the data might be used for. That is, for planning, for agriculture, for example. And that would be described in the documentation. So in this case, since the repository had to work with the data producer to enhance the documentation to describe that, then the uh, uh, repository would be providing an additional level of service. And so you would want to document that additional level of service that you're providing. And to your point about uh, uh, really about the applicability of the data only for certain uses, the repository might want to also work with the data producer to describe limitations, that is, limits on the use of the data. They could say that these data are intended for, planning for agriculture, but should not necessarily be used to plan for urban planning, for example, to decide on the types of structures that you're going to be building. Different data would be used for that purpose. You might want to know about the structure of the soil or something. Uh, uh, when you're building the structures, and these data might be focusing on the types of crops that are appropriate to be grown. And so in this case, by describing the limitations of the data in cooperation with the data producer, the repository they're going beyond the simple level of service where they just distribute the data in the same manner that it was received. Here, they're enhancing the documentation to describe the particular uses or applicability of the data. And then they're also describing limitations on the data. Ideally, they would want to go even further and describe the methodology used to create the data. In this way, anybody who's trying to assess whether the data are appropriate for their use, they can look in the methodology section of the documentation to determine whether the methodology that was used to create the data is appropriate for their planned use. But in creating all this extra information, the documentation, the metadata about the data, the repository has actually added levels of service that they're providing. And so depending on the extent of service, they would then go and in for R0, describe, well, yes, and maybe for certain data, we are disseminating it as we receive it, but for other data sets, we see that we do have to provide additional levels of service. And it might be that for some levels of data, you're providing the enhanced curation. For others, it's even more, and you're providing all levels of curation. And so, in that case, what the repository should be doing is on their template for describing their levels of service, say, yes, we do level 0 if you do disseminate some data just as they're submitted. Some repositories won't do that at all, perhaps. They feel that all data have to be reviewed extensively. They might even conduct an external peer review of the data.
Bob, I think we've gone a little bit over, but these are really good points. And so I guess next week we'll take up R3, and I noticed that ICRISAT FMNR has been in the forum and working on it. So we'll take a look at your responses to the R0s and R1. Thank you so much. Anything else, Bob, you want to say before we sign off?
Yes, please look at your template and start thinking about and documenting some of your responses to R2. And that might be, the response might be that we need to develop an approach. We need to think about what licenses. We might want to think about the guidance that we're providing for our data producers and create a web page for that. Those are the kinds of things that you might want to say for R2 as well. And I want to just end by saying thank you all for your attention, and we look forward to working with you next time.
Yeah, so as
Thank you.
people put in information in their forms, these can be a lot more interactive because you'll have attempted to write up what you believe is the requirement, a valid response to the requirement. We can then interact with you about that response. So the hope is to move these to a more interactive format where the requirement is presented, and the one from the prior week, we can go back over and also look at responses and then make it sort of an iterative process where we're going through each requirement one at a time, reviewing the one from the week before, your responses, and moving to the next one and answering your questions as we do that. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you all, I guess, in, well, I don't know when the next training is. You were going to talk about scheduling, Bob, so.
We did. That was
Okay.
July 10th.
All right, we're going to do July 10th. Great.
And thank you again, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Alex and Robert.
Okay, ciao.
See you in
you.
July. Bye.